Welcome to the Upreneur podcast for the University of Entrepreneurs. I am your host, Jeremy Straub. David, welcome.
Thank you, Jeremy. Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. I was thinking as I was preparing for the conversation today, the first time we met, we were on a plane ride together.
We were.
And I wanted to thank you because one of the things, the advice you gave me as I was asking you for advice on the plane ride was about YPO. And I was asking you, where did you get your advice from, mentorship from in the beginning? And I joined YPO 2 years ago. It's been one of the best things for me in my development personally and professionally.
Yes.
So first, thank you, and I appreciate the advice early on and the continued friendship.
It's one of the great regrets I have in business is that I didn't join YPO, but I had a pseudo YPO. I had a group of 6 people that we shared every 6 months. We had a sort of a board meeting, and we rotated where the meeting was. They were all other franchise companies, and we became the board of directors of that company to sort of pretend each time we had a 2-day meeting.
Yeah.
And we would interview employees and talk to people and make assessments, and then we tell the person that was our host what we thought of what he was doing right or doing wrong, and it was extremely helpful. And we had a pledge of confidentiality, and we had a monthly phone call on top of that. So it was we did that for about 10 years, and it was sort of our version of franchising YPO.
Very cool, very cool. It's one of those ones where if you're running a company on your own, it's lonely at times.
It is.
To be able to do it. So to have that peer network is helpful.
It is.
So, but before we get started and talk a little bit about your journey, you're one of the first guests we've had that's done the franchising on both sides, been a franchisee and a franchisor. Just for people that are starting to consider businesses, starting their own business, can you just give me a layman's term of what a franchisee and a franchisor is, and somebody starting to explore businesses, what they should think about it with it?
Sure. In its simplest form, a franchisee is someone who wants to be in business for themselves, but not by themselves. And so you're buying into a system that's already been proven. There's tens or hundreds or thousands of other franchisees in front of you who have taken the journey ahead of you. So you can talk to people, find out what the business is really like, find out, what kind of hours you're really putting in every day and every week, what kind of capital you really need to invest. And so before you invest a single dollar into the business, you've really got a really good idea of what's ahead of you. And there's certain requirements that franchisors have to do, provide you with a disclosure document, provide you with financial statements, provide you with the names of the people that play important roles in the company and their background. So you really have a full, wide open, clear view of what you're getting into before you get into
it. Those are not my dogs in the background. That is a important call coming through. No worries at all. It's great. It's great. I appreciate you kind of explaining the difference between the franchisee and franchisor, because I think oftentimes people, when they're starting a business, they have no idea how to determine what the costs are associated with that business. They are going to do trial and error and trying to build the systems and processes, from marketing to what's the right pay I'm doing per staff, what's the right hours I should have for the staff, what's the look for them coming through, where's the right location. And you kind of take away a lot of that trial and error guesswork in the franchise model.
All of my businesses that I was the franchisor of with Service Brands International, they were all service businesses, so we didn't have to worry about location, retail location. We didn't have to worry about office, things like that. So it was a little easier, but the business that I'm operating today with my family, hair salons with Sola Salons, the location is incredibly important. And I know nothing about where to put a Sola Salon store.
Right.
So thank goodness.
I think your hair looks great though. I know the salon business here.
So the franchisor has all of that information, and when we find out a vacant building or a vacant space coming up, they can run it through their geo demographic system and say, yeah, A+ or B-, and that just makes it so much easier. You feel so much safer having a franchisor looking out for you, because they want me to perform well, just like they want everyone else to perform well. And if anyone listening to this is remotely interested in starting their own business, I could not recommend starting with a franchise more, because the chance of failure in a business by yourself is about 20 times greater than it is with a franchise, because you're going in eyes wide open, knowing almost everything you can need to know up front.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think most people don't even know where to start. And I want to spend some time talking about how to find franchises and how you've chosen the salon business to get into from the business that you were in before. But I want to go back a little bit in your journey. I mean, you had 7 total brands that were working with you before you got out and actually sold out of those businesses. And that's a little bit unheard of, because most people do 1 or 2 brands, maybe 3 or 4. You're kind of iconic in the franchise industry for having so many successful brands under one umbrella, which is not easy to do. As a franchisor, you're building the systems and the models, and then the franchisees are truly running the business and get all the opportunities of running a business on it. But talk me through, because you didn't start out in just opening up a franchise and an entrepreneur right off the bat. From what I understand, you were in the finance industry a little bit right out of school, and were working for a Fortune 50 company, and then you decided to start joining a franchise to clean houses. So can you tell me a little bit about that journey? Because you have a lot of people that listen here that are working as a W-2 employee somewhere else, and might be working for a large company and want to go out in their own business, but they don't know how, and they're scared of that jump. And you were obviously in a lucrative industry, you had the education to be able to, we would think is an executive path, and you decided to go be an entrepreneur in a franchise model. Can you talk about that initial jump? I know.
Sure. So I want to make it very clear to your listeners that I did not have a silver spoon in my mouth. I grew up, my parents were missionaries. I grew up on Tortola in the British Virgin Islands.
Very cool. I didn't know that.
That was really awesome. But we moved back to Toronto when I was 15 years old.
Wow, that's a change.
Yeah, it was a change, not just in temperature.
Right.
But I ended up pursuing an accounting and finance degree because I was the mail boy in Canada. It's called Imperial Oil, or Esso, not Exxon, but it's a subsidiary of Exxon in Canada. And I worked there, and I was fortunate enough that they did an aptitude test, and I scored very high. They paid for my education, and I was able to go to college because of that. When I graduated, I had this sort of burning desire to do my own thing, be my own thing, but like what you said, I didn't really know where to start or what to do, so I took a job in the accounting and finance in a huge corporation, and really, really liked it. But this friend from my church said, "Dave, you're the numbers guy. I'm going to the seminar tonight about buying a carpet cleaning franchise. Would you come with me?" And one thing led to another, and we ended up buying that franchise together.
Wow.
And so I started out in the ServiceMaster commercial carpet cleaning business. We built a very large business. In fact, we built the largest business at that time in ServiceMaster. And one of my employees, his wife was the founder of Molly Maid, and he said, "David, I think you should take a look at this, and you be the franchisor of it." And a longer story, but I ended up letting a friend of mine buy it, and then a few years later, I traded him some software that we wrote for him for the United States rights, and then ultimately the rights for the rest of the world, ultimately.
Wow.
But that's how that all started. And so I started as a franchisee, I became a franchisor, and then to your point about the multiple brands, again, it wasn't easy. I want to really stress that. And being a franchisor is one of the tougher things, in my opinion, to be, because not only do you need to know the business that you're going into, you need to know the business of franchising, which has a whole set of laws, a whole set of regulations, a whole set of skills that are not related to running a local business. And then you've got training, you've got support, you've got regional meetings, you've got conventions, you've got award trips. There's just a lot going on when you run a franchisor. But
Can you just pause for 1 second, because there's all these things I want to deconstruct in what you're saying here to be able to do it. So you're the first, and just let's start at the beginning. That jump that you made when you went to that seminar learning about the franchise and that, how did you get comfortable enough to do that? Because obviously, like you said, you grew up with your parents being missionaries, and you had a good stable job.
I did.
And then you went and saw the seminar and you said, you know, I'm going to leave that and I'm going to go start my own franchise cleaning, right? And then, so how did you...
Try telling that to your parents.
Well, that's what I'm curious about, is how did you actually get the gumption to do that? What was the driver? Because we have a lot of our listeners are debating on starting up their own business, and that jump is the scariest part to be able to do it. Obviously, the learning and the difficulty that goes along with entrepreneur is extremely hard, but that initial jump is a very difficult thing to do. Do you remember what kind of drove you to do that? Did you always have that entrepreneurial bug? Was it something they said and you just believed in the model to do it? Was it that you were, you know, you had a partner and you're like, you know what, he kind of pushed me to do it. If he was going to do it, at least I could fail with 2 people as opposed to by myself.
Well, there was probably a little bit of that.
Right.
But it was, I want to make this very clear. It was a very difficult jump. It is a very difficult thing, and it's comprised of a few things. One is leaving your job and your career that is going, you know, up.
Yep.
2, borrowing money from family and friends to do it.
Yeah.
And thinking, my gosh, what's going to happen if this doesn't work?
Right.
And then 3, you know, the saying is people will work twice as hard for half as much as long as it's theirs.
Right.
There's a lot of
There's truth to that.
And so that's really what we decided to do. It probably was 2 years before I felt like I'd made a good decision.
Yep.
But it absolutely paid off. And I will say this to your listeners. It's, you know, you hear a lot of people talk about the money and how great being your own boss is. For me, the number one thing was the control of my own time. You know, I could work till 10 o'clock at night, but I could also go play racquetball for 2 hours a day in the middle of the day if I wanted to.
Right.
And I couldn't do that, and I didn't realize that
Yep.
until that freedom happened. And so to me, that freedom of my own time and controlling it was worth more than the restraints of having a quote-unquote 9-to-5 job.
Well, and I think you're seeing that more and more where you were probably on the cutting edge of doing that with your peer group at that time, meaning out starting and being independent. We're seeing younger people now be much more comfortable with a freelance type model and having either multiple employers or feeling comfortable starting a business back when you were actually building out these franchises.
Well, you know, even this week on the news, you hear these high-tech Silicon Valley companies are all thinking of going to 4-day work weeks and giving their employees more freedom, more time off, because A, they're more creative when they're at work, but B, they're competing against these people starting their own businesses, and they're going to have to give them some of those benefits as an employee.
Yeah, it's probably a good time to be a franchisor right now.
It is a good time.
So you then made another jump though. So then you build out your own franchise. You had the opportunity to buy into Molly Maid as a franchisor. You decided to pass on it. I'm curious because then you went back and you ended up doing a trade, which I want to talk about too. But when you passed on at that point, what was the decision making going through and saying, hey, I'm not ready to be a franchisor and being a franchisee? Because I think we also have a lot of listeners that they have a business that's cash flowing well, things are good, and they're scared to make a jump to go big because they don't want to screw up what they're doing well. And I'm curious at that point in those decisions, what made you decide to pass?
Well, let's be honest, it was the dumbest decision I had ever made, and still is. However, I'll tell you why I didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
This was in the early 80s.
Yeah.
Maid service was not something that was a mass market thing like it is today.
Yeah.
When we ultimately started, every time I would travel to a different city or place in the U.S., I would look at the yellow pages. And when we started, there was 2, maybe 5 in a big city of maid service in the yellow page category. Today, there's probably 100.
Yep.
So it was a new category, and I didn't know just if it was gonna how it was gonna shake out.
Yep.
There was no one else really doing it like this organized scale with uniforms and cars and insurance and bonded employees and all of the things that made Molly Maid, you know, what it ultimately became. But it was very, very quickly after I saw what happened in Canada that I realized I had missed an opportunity. So when the opportunity...
Because that was when really we started having dual incomes.
That's correct.
Right?
That's
and
correct.
that was where all of a sudden you didn't have a stay-at-home spouse that was doing
Yes.
some of the cleaning and taking care of it. It was right around the 80s and 90s when that started
That's
coming
exactly right, and it was the advent of the dual income household, and it was the advent of really no time, less time, and people didn't want to spend that time cleaning their home. They were tired, they had been at work all day, And then what we discovered, which is extremely counterintuitive, is you would think that in a recession or a slow time or someone's been laid off or let go, that one of the first things they would cut is maid service.
Yep.
That is not true. It's the last thing they're gonna cut.
That's
It's
interesting.
extremely addictive,
Yeah.
particularly for the female person in the household who traditionally was tasked with that job.
You know, I remember seeing a Molly
Very
Maid
addictive.
car out in front of one of my neighbors back when I was a kid, right? So this was in the 80s. And I asked my mom what it was, and she told me that. And I'm like, well, why am I cleaning the toilets, Mom? So my mom ended up having me clean the toilets, and I think that was
You were
part of
cheap
my
labor.
chores. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I wish she would have done the Molly Maid piece. So then when it came back to you, I think it was interesting so you passed on the opportunity to be a franchisor, and it kind of came back full circle where you had it again. And this time was interesting because I think most people, and especially if you're not in business, you haven't been negotiating before, you're not thinking about deals. You're just kind of, you work for somebody, you do what you're supposed to do in that. Or even if you're a franchisor running the SOPs that you're supposed to run. But now you had an opportunity to buy Molly Maids, and at the same time you had a software company, and you go, you know what, I don't want to pay cash. Let me think of another way I can get this deal done. And you were creative in your thought process of how to get the deal done. Can you talk to me through a little bit about what happened during that and how you were able to acquire Molly Maids?
So I've always been kind of a computer geek, or at least a wannabe.
Yeah.
And I had, early Radio Shack TSR-80s. I had built a PDP-11 computer that I bought for scrap. And so I've always been a wannabe. So when the opportunity came at ServiceMaster, I wrote some software that streamlined our business incredibly with billing.
Yeah.
And Jim McKenzie.
All self-learned.
Yeah, all
self-taught. Yeah.
Mhm. And Jim McKenzie, the gentleman that had Molly Maid Canada at the time, he said, do you think you could write some software to keep track of all this royalties I'm collecting? And so two bells went off in my head. One is, shoot, I gave that up.
Right.
And two, maybe there's an opportunity here to get an opportunity back. And I had the good fortune, I should tell your listeners, of being born in the United States on the way to Tortola, so I was an American citizen. So
Okay.
I knew that was an option for me.
Yeah.
And so we basically wrote some software that tracked the franchisees' weekly royalties and what was owed and what was unpaid and what was paid. And the company still runs on it today. And so I traded that software with them to purchase the United States, because Jim didn't want to go into the US. It was a very different market, different laws, different scenarios. So he was happy to stay in Canada, and we moved and set up headquarters in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Nice. And I think it's a good example of where you were able to identify a need, and then just opposed to solving it how you want to solve it, still get what you want at the same time and negotiate something that didn't seem like that big of a deal to him, but for you it ended up being a very lucrative opportunity for you long term.
Yeah, and again, it had been a proven concept, right?
Yep.
There's not that many difference between Canadians and Americans when
Right.
it comes to something like that. So
Yeah.
I knew that all we had to do was get some in play,
Yeah.
and we would have something. So one of the fellows that went to the church I went to in Ann Arbor had a cleaning service. He had 27 customers. He'd been doing it for 6 or 7 years. And I talked him into converting it to a Molly Maid franchise, Ron Barnsdale, and he and his wife. And then a few years later, they were generating, almost $750,000. They couldn't believe what happened. They couldn't believe what a difference the marketing made, the cars made. This is something he'd been doing for 6 years.
Yeah.
And that story ended up on the front page of the USA Today Money section. And after that, it was just, we were on a rocket ship ride. We couldn't sell them quick enough, we couldn't train them quick enough. It just spread like wildfire, and basically the country sold out very quickly.
Well, you're making it seem easy.
Yeah, it's
and
not.
I was reading an article from Sun Sentinel back in like 85 or 86, and it had to do with Molly Maid, right? And you came down here into South Florida to be able to open up a franchise. I think you had one, or maybe you're trying to have more. And there was a competitor that was based in Boynton Beach called Pop-Ups, I think it was.
Okay.
And they already had like 30 or 40 maid services here, and everybody thought that was the go-to place. You came right in where there was competitive. Ultimately, Pop-Up went bankrupt. They had a ton of issues going through on it. So I'm curious on the bad advice or the missteps you see as franchisors, and from that example that I read about, maybe you can talk a little bit about how people came in with a similar model and maybe why they weren't successful and why you were successful. And as people are thinking either becoming a franchisee or a franchisor, what is some bad advice or missteps that you've seen that enabled people not to be successful? And you maybe use that as an example with you versus Pop-Up and how you ended up succeeding so well in South Florida versus them.
So if you think about this, there's no barriers to entry, right? A mop, a bucket, a broom. I mean, anyone can do this today.
Yep.
We can do this by lunchtime.
Yep.
You know, we can be in the Maid business. So everyone was like, well, why Molly Maid? What? So you have to start differentiating yourselves in all of the little things. So one of the big things, and I want to come back to the franchise mistakes, but I'm trying to keep this to the franchisee for a second.
Yep.
One of the things is the customer's number one thing is trust. They're typically at work, so their quote unquote diamond ring is in the jewelry box, and their underwear is on the bed, and you know, so the whole idea of am I safe? Is my home going to be safe? So with the insured, that was a big deal. The bonding, every employee was bonded so that if there was something, you know, they knew that they were going to be covered. The idea that it was the same two people every time. The idea that there was a big old marked car in the driveway so the neighbors knew, oh, somebody's in that house right now. They know who they were. It was our number one marketing device, so they said, well, boy, if the Joneses have Molly Maid, maybe we should have Molly Maid. And for the first probably 15 years, we hardly had to market. It was the cars that really carried the day. And then over time, our good competitors, started using cars, and the cars paid for themselves in marketing.
Huh.
But to your other question, why did somebody fail? There's an allure in franchising that goes like this. Boy, I have a business, I'm gonna franchise it. It's successful for me, it works right here. I'm gonna go and sell 10, 20, 30, 100, 400, and I'm gonna make exponential amounts of money. It does not work that way. There's a term that we call in franchising, franchise hell.
Okay.
And that's somewhere between 30 franchises and 100. That's when you think you're gonna make all this money, but it's costing you anywhere between $5,000 and $25,000 per franchise for at least 3 years before they start becoming profitable to you.
Huh.
So most people do not understand that. So if you were to sell 100 franchises on day one, you would probably be in the hole $2.5 million, $3 million on year 3.
Wow.
And people just don't realize, because they have to start, it's a one customer at a time business. It's not like a restaurant where a restaurant have their grand opening, and that's the highest number of sales they had in 5 years.
Right.
We're the exact opposite. Day 1 is one customer. Day 2 is 2, then 4, then 8, then 16. So it's a brick by brick process. So it takes about 2 to 3 years for a franchisee to get up to some substantial size where the royalties coming back to the franchisor pay for all of the expenses of training and support, meetings, conventions, marketing. It's not for the faint of heart, and it's certainly not for the faint of wallet.
And so you would, as you built out the different brands, you were always thinking about it's going to be like a 36-month break even, at least cash break even to start doing it, or that's actually to make your money back?
At least 36 months.
Okay.
And the irony is this: the faster you grow, the more you get into debt.
Right.
So there's a trade-off of what's the right growth rate, and of course, and then some people say, well, why don't you just open Michigan first and then Ohio, and it doesn't work that way, because you can't advertise and market to enough potential people. So you really have to market to the whole country. It's just as economic to run a franchise ad nationally as it is to run an ad for Fort Lauderdale. And so you might as well cast a wider net.
Yeah. So you mentioned something earlier about some of the details, and we were talking about the examples going through. I think, I always tell people the idea doesn't have to be great, but the details and the level of activity you're doing around that idea combined with the idea work out. So the idea of starting a maid service isn't a great idea, right? You're like, I think it could be cool, but everybody can do it. Like you said, we can do it by 11 o'clock. But all those little details you put down, from the car to the bonded to it's gonna be 2 people, not 1 person, all those small details allowed you to be able to outpace your competitors and put your competitors out of business too, right? You were a reasonably priced one, you weren't super expensive in a sense of being able to do it. So the people that were actually going to be doing the work and buy in earlier, it wasn't somebody that was gonna delegate out the work. You had the owner-operator actually doing it. How did you come up with all those ideas? The idea of the car and that, is this you sitting around with a white paper thinking about it? Is it like just an evolution and kind of trial and error? One of your franchisees did something, you're like, that's a great best practice, let me go sell that, or explain that to all my other franchisees?
It was a lot of that.
Yeah.
It was a lot of feedback from the field of what worked.
Yeah.
But it started with Adrian Stringer in Toronto, started with Jim McKenzie, who then, built a base in Canada. We took that base and multiplied it significantly, but also at the same time, like you said, we got a lot of feedback in from our franchisees of what was working, what wasn't working, how we tweak. I mean, it still gets tweaked today.
Right.
It's almost 40 years later.
Right.
And I want to say something to your listeners. I love businesses that sound like, no one else, like why would a college graduate do that?
Yeah.
I love those kinds of businesses.
The competition's low.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's easy pickings.
Yep.
And the other thing I love, which is why I love the hair styling business, with the franchise that I'm a franchisee in now, is the repeat aspect of the business. Once you get a customer and you can keep that customer for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, that's just a phenomenal event in a business, as opposed to having to start over every Monday morning again, figuring out how am I gonna get more customers, starting at absolutely dead zero. I mean, I used to hate that feeling of waking up. I've always been in repeat business, but I used to hate the feeling that I think other people had every Monday morning. I had a guy that had a big electrician business in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And he would say to me, David, it's Sunday night, 8 o'clock. I don't have one customer on the books for tomorrow morning.
Oh.
They'd have to run all their ads again, have to run all of the stuff
Yeah.
again to keep those 20 trucks running.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't a repeat business. And so anything that repeats on some short frequency,
Yeah.
Haircuts about a month, cleanings a week or 2 weeks.
Yep.
I love those kind of businesses where you pay to get the customer one time,
Yep.
and you do everything you can do to keep them forever.
Well, what I thought was great with the model you did was, not only did you find a reoccurring client, right? So maybe you would spend a decent amount of marketing, maybe not right in the beginning because you had the cars that were doing it. But then once you had the household, you realize there's other services that they're using that are similar, right? They want a handyman.
Yes.
They might want a pool cleaner. They
Yes.
might, in some of your other businesses that you did off that. How did you decide to take a household and go, okay, where's other places they could be spending money in a repeating service business? And let me go find them. Did they start to find you? Did you actually go find like a handyman company I think you picked up in Massachusetts? Was it that you were out searching for it and you just found a good model that was already franchising out to be able to do it? Walk me through a little bit about, I got the client, now how do I sell them more stuff that they're already using and become a vendor for that?
Well, that was definitely the premise.
Yeah.
The premise was twofold.
Yeah.
One, that I've already got the customer, what else can they buy from us?
Yeah.
And the second thing was, we were sold out in terms of franchises. We were, in Southern California, South Florida, we couldn't put another Molly Maid in here. There was no way we could expand our service, so the only way that we could is to find another franchise service to offer into it. So we then simply went on what we thought the customer would want most. And, in the last couple of decades, the population is aging, the contractors are fewer and fewer and far between. Everyone in South Florida certainly knows that.
Yeah.
It's hard to find a good handyman, it's hard
It's
to
true.
find a good
It's 100%
painter.
true.
So we went in those directions, and we took the principles of Molly Maid, which was the uniforms, the vehicles, the insured, the bonded, the on-time, the idea of middle of the road pricing, satisfaction guaranteed, those kinds of things that we knew our customers expected from Molly Maid, but we went with a totally different brand and a different franchisee, but we're able to sell those customers all those services.
Interesting. So I'll pivot a little bit and talk about, because one of the things that you did back when it wasn't cool, right now it's the companies that give back. It's part of their business model and brand, right? Patagonia gives a certain percentage of revenue. You have Zappos that does, or not Zappos, you have Tom Shoes that does one pair of shoes for the family in Africa to here. But you, and this is a cool story I was reading about you, you were home, I think sick with pneumonia or something like that, and you were watching O.J. Simpson, and you came up with the idea that the company could actually help give back in that too.
It wasn't me. I was home, it was true, I watched the entire O.J. Simpson trial.
I remember watching that when I was
Fortunately or unfortunately had pneumonia.
Right.
And my wife, by proximity, was sort of, the country was made aware of the issue of domestic violence during that trial.
Yep.
And one of the Molly Maids came in that week,
Yeah.
and she had 2 black eyes. And
Wow.
my wife said, what happened? And she didn't want to tell her, and she just kind of pushed it off. And long story short, that led to the idea of what could we do as a company in each market where we operated to help people who were victims of domestic violence. And that ended up being the single greatest thing that ever happened to our company. My wife Karen ended up in the White House with Al Gore and got the award for doing the country a great service with this thing. We got tremendous publicity from it every October, and when Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we got each franchisee to realize that if they did this in their community, they're actually helping their community get better. And so it became a franchisee-driven process, even the idea. We created the 501(c), but all of the activity takes place in the franchisees' markets in the month of October. And it was just one of those God-sent ideas that just happened to spark when my wife saw our housekeeper with 2 black eyes.
Wow. Well, it's amazing you did that so early on, because right now I think companies are now starting to realize they have to be stewards in the community. And then I think probably attributed to your success is you being able to figure that early on too.
No doubt about it.
Now, do you think your parents being missionaries and obviously them giving back for so long helped you in the sense of making sure that it wasn't just about money for you in the business, but wanting to give back to the community? Do you think part of that happened, or just was that the experience, or your wife also? Your wife, you've been married for a long time too. She's been your partner for
40 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations, very cool.
Yes, I do think that. I think a bigger thing that I'm only now starting to realize in my life is I've never had I have a pretty wide view of the world, just because I grew up in almost a third world country, and we didn't have electricity. We had to use kerosene lanterns, and we ultimately got electricity, but not in the first few years that we were there. And I went to the local school. My sister and I were the only white people in the whole school.
Right.
Never saw myself as white. Never saw myself as black. And so it gave me just a different view of the world, that I didn't see borders or countries or people or races, and so it's just helped, I think, give me a greater appreciation. And one of the hardest things that we had to do in growing Molly Maid was to take somebody that had a really good job, a good education, and convince them that the best thing for them to do now was to go into the toilet cleaning business. That was a really, really hard sell.
Yep.
That was the single biggest block we had, was somebody getting over the stigma of being in the maid business.
Right.
And I would give them my little spiel about, well, I love those kinds of businesses because I do. That leave me those scraps. I'm happy to take those.
Yep.
And today, it's not unusual for a Molly Maid business to do $2 million a year.
That's crazy.
And who would have thought that when we started? We were looking at the President's Club, the top of the top of the top, being franchises that got to $300,000 a year.
Yep.
And today, now there's a Molly Maid doing almost $5 million a year.
Yep.
And who would have ever thought that? And a lot of that was because of the systems and the processes and technology and the marketing. We were the first company in, I think, all of franchising on the internet to sell franchises, and then ultimately to sell customers. And so we were pretty innovative all the way along. We never really saw ourselves as a house cleaning company. We saw ourselves as a way to help franchisees earn a great living and have a good business. And today, there's hardly any of them for sale. I tried to buy ones for my kids when they got married. I couldn't even get one back from,
Right.
because no one wants to give them up.
Have you heard my name before? I started this, can I just have the franchise?
Yeah, so it was the business just couldn't have been better for us.
So, and clearly you've been recognized from the IFF, which is the International Franchise Association.
Yes.
And your involvement with them and continuing to grow franchise and them recognize you as Entrepreneur of the Year. But you've done that with a partner in most of your businesses. And I think a lot of people are scared and they say, you can never have a partner in your business, the partner's always bad. And there's this stigma of the idea of having a partner, yet you've proven multiple times again and again, even your first venture into that franchise that you bought when you left the Fortune 50 company, that it can succeed as a partnership. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on this, because you've probably seen with other people partnerships go bad, but you've been able to succeed on it. What your thoughts are on it?
So I'll go the extreme opposite of what most people think. I actually have not done a business without a partner.
Okay.
And I've had probably 30 businesses to date.
Yep.
And I've done every single one of them with at least one partner.
Yep.
And so I think that partners, the right partner, obviously, that's cliche, but the right partner who brings something to the table that you don't bring to the table is extremely important for making a very successful business. And it's a much longer story, and maybe for one of your future podcasts. But I met a gentleman who, in the late '80s, who I became partners with. He was 20 years older than I was. And he and I did all those businesses together at Service Brands and a few others. And we, to this day, have never had a raised voice conversation.
Wow.
To this day.
Wow.
And he brought a sort of a wise, paced approach to the business. And, you know, we always kept our emotions in check when we were with each other. And we set objectives and goals for the business every year, just like everyone does. But they were thought through, and they were not just trying to, you know, just get every penny out of the business world we could. They were thought through with things like, well, you know, what's your lifestyle? What do you want your lifestyle to be? Do you really want to travel that much? Do you really want to push that? You know, it was all of those things were factored in. And so, you know, one of the things that I'm ultra proud of is my son was in high school, was a really good hockey player, and I never missed a single game. And that's why we were building a multi-million-dollar company. And so we were able to do that, and that was an important part of him helping me not just have a great business, but also have a good life. And he was wise enough to see that, you know, I could fire David McKinnon up and get him going. We could probably do more than we've got on the books, but there's other things that are just as important.
Is there any recommendations you would give to people exploring a partnership? I know you mentioned a little bit about you kind of figured out shared values, you figured out, you know, what lifestyle you wanted, that you knew that ahead of each other, that one wasn't going to be upset if somebody was going to the hockey games and now they were actually probably encouraging it. Any advice you would give? I know that there's been, as you're thinking of something, I'll give you a second to try to think through kind of what your response is. There's a book called Rocket Fuel, and when I read that, it talked about, similar to what you're saying, two different, if you're going to bring on a partner, which you need to have, and it talked about like Wozniak and Steve Jobs, it talked about Paul Allen and Bill Gates and kind of their combinations, and how a lot of those pairs led to the success that you saw of that. Can you talk a little bit about advice you might give to somebody that's considering a partnership and deciding if it's the right thing or not?
Sure. So most partnerships are geared around money. Right? Someone's going to
give the money, they don't spend it.
Someone's going to put up the money, and then they are going to want it back with a return. And so structuring that is extremely important, to make sure that it's reasonable, to make sure that the time frames are good. And I would say this to the listeners: I would want to find a partner that doesn't need the money. So if it doesn't work out, it's like, oh well. You know, it's never that easy, but if you can get that, that's the best. But then have a partner where you have all of the upsides talked about, but you have all of the downsides talked about. What if, you know, I end up not liking you? What if this doesn't work out? What if we don't get along? What if? And so talking about the prenup is just as important as talking about the business. And I believe a good prenup is, in business,
Yep.
is the solution for having a great partnership. Because everyone knows what is going to happen if one of the parties wants it to happen.
Yep.
And that keeps everybody in check.
Yep,
And
that's a good
so
point.
I think a good prenup is good, but just talking it all through up front and having a partner that's in my cases, the only time I've had a difficult partnership, and there was one, it was when the two of us were in the same business, in the same office. All of my other partnerships, they were separate, they were not in the office. And I would recommend that.
That's good advice, that's good advice. So I got a question, right? Obviously, failures are what create a lot of successes, and you have a lot of downturns. Can you talk about one of your favorite failures that you had? I know we've talked a story about your wife on the back of the boat, maybe that's one of them, or there's maybe another story you might have, but I think that the most successful entrepreneurs learn from these failures and it makes them stronger. Or, sometimes they just had, some string of good luck that helped them through that failure.
Yeah, so the one you're referring to is definitely a huge failure, and I'm not even sure to this day who was to blame for it, but here it is, real simple. We were at about 120 franchises, the business was booming. We partnered with a Fortune 500 company that wanted to buy the whole company, but they bought in a minority share. The franchisees didn't like that. They felt that, quote unquote, we'd sold out. So about 35 of them went and hired a lawyer, and that lawyer sued the company and me,
Yeah.
pretty heavy, with all kinds of charges. Each franchisee had given, I think, the lawyer, maybe it was $10,000, so he had, a bunch of money to burn through.
Yeah.
And long story short, we lost the company. The company was about to go into bankruptcy.
Wow.
Other company that we were partnered with thought that I got fired, and we were about to lose everything personally as well. And we had a boat, and we were basically planning to move back to Toronto and in the basement of her parents' home. And it was a total low point in my life. I was 31 years old,
Yeah.
and I thought I had, achieved everything and more. And it was really a 2x4 to the head. And on that weekend when my wife, let's just say, we've got a tank of gas, let's use it, and that'll be our last trip on the boat, and that'll be, we'll go back to Toronto next week and figure out what we're gonna do with the rest of our life. And two things happened that weekend. One, she was on the back of the boat, and I guess had been sobbing, and the guy walked by and saw her, and he asked her why, and she told him. He said, well, have your husband come down and see me. So I get back, and she says, oh, I'm sorry, I was on back, and this guy saw me crying, he wants to talk to you. So I went down and talked to him. His name's Doug Busby, and he was one of the top attorneys in Detroit. And I told him what happened. He goes, you're not gonna give up, are you? I go, well, I don't know what to do, I don't have any money. He says, well, I'm gonna take your case, and I'm gonna take it for free. You're not gonna pay me anything.
Wow.
And I said these words to him. I said, Doug, why on earth would you do that? And he, without one hesitation, he said, how old are you? I said, I'm 31. He said, David, when I win your case for you, you're gonna make me your attorney for the rest of your life, and I'm gonna make so much money off of it. And I said, you know what, Doug, that's a good answer. Because if you do win this case for me, and I survive, I will make you my attorney the rest of it.
Yeah.
And that's what happened.
Wow.
There's a sad twist to it, though. He died a year after we won the case.
Ah.
So the next day, after that meeting, I met the gentleman I told you about that I've been partners with on about 30 businesses. And that next day, he agreed to, I'd never met him before. And we were on a picnic table, just chatting, what do you do, what do you do? Long story short, he said, I'll fund your retake of the company. And that has been the single best friendship I've had my entire life for the last 30 years.
What a weekend.
What a weekend.
Wow, wow, that's unbelievable.
In 2 days.
Jeez.
Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah.
1989, August 4th.
Well, I can see why you're married for 40 years too. Your wife helped out in that process.
She did.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That's a great story. That's a great story to be able to do it. And then your partnership with, is that Lynn?
Lindray.
Yeah, it's been your partner for that period of time. So from then on, that was the one that you guys have never raised your voice, Phil, or you've talked to the whole time. Wow, that's an awesome weekend. Very cool. Thank you for sharing.
And back to the partner question.
Yeah.
And I didn't pick Lynn per se, because I had never met him before.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, this guy, to this day, is still my biggest cheerleader.
Yeah.
He doesn't see me as he definitely sees me as an equal.
Yeah.
But he also sees me as somebody that he wants to see me win.
Yeah.
And that, if you can find that in a partner where they don't just want the money, but they want everything for your success, for your family, for your kids, for your, everything, that he cheers me on to this day.
That's
and
great
I just
advice.
can't tell you how valuable that is.
That's great advice. Now, he's also down here in Florida some of the time too?
And he's lived here for the entire time I've been partners with him, yes.
Now you've been coming down to Florida for a while now, obviously here and there when you had the franchises, but now have a place down here. Can you talk a little bit about a hidden gem you might have here in Florida that you'd recommend?
The Crystal River.
Yeah.
North of Tampa.
Yeah.
In an hour, you'll see more manatee, more eagles, and more big fish than you've seen anywhere else that I've seen on the planet.
I've never heard of it. Okay, I have an office in Tampa, so I'll have to go out there.
And I think one that's maybe not so hidden would just be the Keys.
Yeah.
I just love the Florida Keys. I mean, that's the whole story of Henry Flagler and how they built the train to Key West, and the tragedies around that, and the if you can imagine trying to build, almost 200-mile railroad without fax, telephones, without how they coordinated all of the shipment of the materials and the labor, and just the idea that they did that with basically 4 people in the office is just, to me, an incredible story. And then the idea of the beauty of the Keys, of the water and the ocean. It's just, I love the Keys. It's a treasure to be able to just jump in the car and be there in an hour and a half.
It's crazy that most people aren't into the Keys, or not more people are in the Keys. I guess if you're traveling anywhere else in the country and you're going to fly through Florida and you're going to go somewhere tropical, you end up in the islands.
Yeah.
And so for us that live down here, it's such a great place. It's not heavily trafficked. It still feels relatively native per se, as opposed to over commercialized.
Yes.
Compared to a lot of other places. I was also, when you talk about Henry Flagler, I was been reading a book. It's about the most influential Floridians. A friend of mine, Senator George Lemieux, wrote it. But it's been such an interesting read on how Florida was built. And it talked about even who invented air conditioning, who invented and figured out what was causing malaria, because people couldn't even figure out it was mosquitoes, and it took a while to understand what that was. But a couple of those, along with Flagler building the train down here, on how much that impacted Florida's growth afterwards. So, yeah, for sure. Can you talk a little bit about the legacy you're starting to build, and that's around the franchisee side? And then you mentioned it earlier around solo salons with that, and you've opened up with your children. And what made you decide to go from a franchisor to a franchisee, and you got your kids in the business too, to be able to do it is kind of building a legacy for them, and also, helping out your lifestyle too. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, again, back to the idea from the beginning of the podcast that the franchise is sort of the safest way to go into business.
Yep.
I was looking for a way to involve my kids in a business that I could be involved in, that they could be involved in, but where there would be another entity, a franchisor, involved to help keep us on the straight and narrow.
Yep.
And so a friend of mine, Don DeBolt, who was the president of the International Franchise Association 30 years ago, is in his retirement and sunset years. And he talked to me a couple, 3 years ago about how great his solo salons were doing. And so, I said, Don, tell me about this. So I flew my kids up. My kids initially wanted nothing to do with it. I flew them up. We spent a day with him and his son. And once we saw the solo salon concept, we all just went head over heels and said, yeah, we want to do this. It's a little capital intensive, which is why it's probably not for the quote unquote average person. But these salons, we're strictly the landlord. We're not actually in the hair business. We rent studios to hair stylists and hair professionals and beauty professionals. And so it's kind of it's more of a real estate play than it is an operating business play. but it suits the lifestyle of what I wanna have with my kids, my grandkids. It doesn't make them work, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's back to what I talked about earlier about repeat business, right? It's
Yeah.
just weekly rent, and it stems from the person needing their hair done, their nails done, their whatever, that business, there's always a repeat aspect to it. So that's why we like the hair salon business.
Well, I love the fact that you're now also back to being a franchisee in a business and
Full circle.
full circle, and the fact that, most people think the franchisors are just making boatloads of money, and you talked about the first few years and how hard it is, and then, the franchisees aren't a good opportunity for it, and it's clear that you still see the franchisees as a big opportunity because you are one right now in these businesses, so it's pretty cool to see on both sides.
I believe in franchising to the core.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm as diehard as you're gonna meet, of somebody who believes that in franchising with people with the right motives and the right concepts, and you can find that out through your research and
Yep.
talking to people. There's no better combination than people using, in the case of a franchisee, their capital with your ideas and your coaching and your support to become successful. And if the franchisor genuinely wants you to be successful,
Yep.
it's almost a no-fail scenario.
Yeah.
It's just, I just believe in it, and that's why I put my money in it.
Well, yeah, clearly, you obviously had a big exit with exiting out of ServiceMaster and that, and then to be able to still go into the business, and that's a good place to put your money, shows that you put your money where your mouth is. Last question for you, and I know you just shared an example of this, but what was your most memorable day in your career? So it could be something that might be business related on a transaction, it could be something of an impact you had on some individual on it, but something that you feel looking back going, either that was a turning point in you starting to see yourself differently as a business leader, or maybe it was just, just a small day that you're able to solve, or there was an acquisition or a sale or something.
So it's an easy question for me, and
Okay.
it's two of them.
Okay.
The weekend that you referred to, what a weekend.
Yeah.
The moment that I met Lynn was definitely a line in the sand. Everything in my life today points back to that moment,
Wow.
everything.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be here with you today, wouldn't have been on that plane with you,
Yeah.
wouldn't have met you, wouldn't have, been in Solo Swans, wouldn't have had an exit if it were not for that day.
Yep.
And so that's definitely a line in the sand that was a demarcation from total disaster failure to, by the world standards anyways, pretty successful
Yeah.
business venture. The second one was the day we sold the company, but not because of what people think.
Okay.
It's,
Because you did get a good payday.
we had a wonderful payday, but we also gave back. And our employees were told, they did not know the company was being sold.
Yeah.
There was maybe the top 4 or 5 people knew, but the rest of them didn't. And we gave away about 10% of the proceeds
Wow.
back to the employees. And I want to, in terms of how significant that was per employee, many people got 5 times their salary.
Wow.
Or more.
Wow.
And the lowest somebody got would have been 2 or 3 times their salary.
Wow.
So, and I tell that story for this reason. I made a decision that when we were gonna sell the company, I was gonna cut it clean. I wasn't gonna keep, I wanted the company to go on without me.
Yep.
And let the new people be with it. And I made that clear to the employees that day. I said, this is probably the last day you're gonna see me. This is gonna be, and it wasn't just me, it was my partners and it was a team of us.
Yep.
But someone had a iPhone going and they videotaped parts of it. And they branded it the Oprah moment. And it was when everyone felt they got something that they didn't know was coming.
Wow.
And it completely changed lives in a way that they never saw coming.
What made you
And,
decide to do that?
We had planned it all along from we'd planned to have an exit of the company for probably 5 years.
Yep.
And again, back to my partner's wisdom, Lynn, let's not rush. Let's do this in an organized fashion. In the end, we'll have 2 really good decisions to make. Keep the company because it's so good, or sell the company because it's so good.
Yep.
And those are 2 really good decisions.
Yeah.
So we're gonna run the company and allow ourselves to pick one of those 2 choices on a date in the future. And we hit that date within a month. And so we knew it was coming, and in that process, we said, okay, now how are we gonna take care of the employees? So we did a couple of things. They couldn't move the company for 3 years.
Yep.
Couldn't terminate people, couldn't, just sort of make it skinny, if you will.
Yep.
We protected, we took care of all of that in the contracts, and on top of that, we then, tried to be generous with everybody, and I think we ended up accomplishing that.
Well, I love how throughout your career you have allowed the business to be able to help people create a great life for yourself, but create a great life for the people around you and impact the communities. And you hope that more business leaders take your path that you did that. So congrats on your success. I appreciate you taking the time. Lots of good memories from here.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, that was
Thank you,
fun.
sir.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching the Upreneur podcast, and don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe, and share this with anybody who you think needs to hear it.